The battlefield was thick with smoke and screams and blood and fire, and she crawled through it with half a leg and one lung still working, choking on dust and agony as her own people left her behind, like forgotten trash. But just when her vision blurred and her heart begged for the end, a shadow fell over her, and she looked up, expecting death, yet found something stranger than salvation, a human kneeling beside her, not with a weapon, but with trembling hands and medical gauze and eyes filled with something she had never seen before in war. She didn't know how long she had been lying there, but the dirt was warm with blood, both hers and others, and the air tasted like rust and death, and all she could hear was distant shouting, muffled booms, and the hiss of burning metal. She had tried to crawl once, but the jagged bone in her thigh made her scream, so she stayed still, her face pressed against the earth, as if it might hold her together, and the pain was something sharp and alive like a beast gnawing her from inside out, and every breath was a fight with fire in her lungs and pressure in her chest. And even though she was a warrior, a trained soldier of the Varkari Dominion, she could feel herself slipping, her mind floating away like ashen wind, and she thought maybe this was how it ended, not with glory, not with vengeance, but alone, forgotten like a cracked blade. Thrown in the mud, her armor was shattered, her leg was half gone, blown clean off below the knee from a human artillery blast, and though she had been told humans were monsters no better than beasts with tools, she saw none of them now, just silence around her, and memories flooding in of her little sister, her old teacher, her mother's hands before the conscription officer took her away, and she didn't know why her eyes were wet, maybe from pain, maybe from the way the world dimmed around her, and she wanted to scream, but her voice had dried with her blood. She thought she heard footsteps, or maybe her brain was making up ghosts again, until the shadow moved across her vision, blocking the sun, and for a heartbeat she feared it was one of her own commanders come to finish her for cowardice. But when she opened her eyes and forced her head to tilt, she saw boots, thick human boots covered in dust and ash, and next a figure kneeling beside her, the face obscured by a helmet with a cracked visor and a red cross drawn over the heart. And instead of reaching for a weapon, he opened a bag, and she tried to snarl, but it came out a whimper. And she spat at him weakly, but it landed on her own chin, and the human didn't move except to say something she didn't understand. And she flinched when his hand touched her shoulder, but it was gentle. She realized that even through the pain, his hand was gentle, and she hated how it made her eyes burn again, hated how her enemy had hands that trembled when they saw her blood, and she wanted to ask why, but her mouth only moved without words. And he leaned in and said something slow and soft and foreign, and his other hand went to her leg, or what was left of it, and she cried out, and he stopped, not from fear but concern, and he nodded like he was trying to tell her to breathe, to hold on, to not let go, and she couldn't understand his words, but she understood his eyes, and something deep in her chest broke like a dam, and she sobbed. She didn't mean to, but the tears came with the pain and the relief and the confusion, because no one had ever looked at her like that, like she was worth saving. And she felt the warmth of a gel around her wound and the pressure of bandages, and she could tell he was working fast, methodical, even though every part of her was alien to him, even though she was his enemy, and the war still raged behind them. He stayed, and when a blast shook the ground nearby, he didn't flinch, didn't run, just whispered something she imagined meant almost there, or stay with me. And when he lifted her to his back with her arms around his neck, she could feel his heartbeat pounding steady and strong and real, and she buried her face against his armor, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because it was the first time since the battle began that she felt like maybe she wasn't dying alone. Maybe mercy still existed even in war. Maybe Monsters came with first aid kits and trembling hands and eyes that dared to care when no one else would. The human didn't speak her language and she didn't speak his, but something passed between them in the quiet moments between bombs and shouts. Something ancient and wordless, something made of pain and breath, and the will to survive. And when he carried her through the wreckage of what used to be a forest of steel bones and blackened trees, she could feel every jolt of his steps. Through her body every sting of movement in her torn flesh, but she held on because the fear of falling was worse than the pain, and somehow her pride, which once stood like a mountain, had crumbled like sand in a storm, and she no longer cared that she was Valkyrie or that he was human. All she knew was the warm blood dripping from her bandaged leg, and the way his fingers gripped her thigh tightly, not cruelly, but to keep the bleeding down, and she tried to stay awake to not pass out, because if she did, she feared she might never wake again, and every time her head drooped he would tap her wrist, or squeeze her arm, or grunt something that pulled her back to the world, and she hated that she started to feel safe, because safety was a lie in war, and yet this human wore that lie like a shield between her and the death that hunted in the skies. Above they passed over corpses, burned-out transports, half-crushed mechs, and she saw faces in the dirt, soldiers of both sides frozen in pain or fear, and part of her wanted to scream at the sky to demand why she was alive when so many others weren't. And when they reached a shallow ravine where a wrecked vehicle had formed a crude shelter, he finally set her down and collapsed beside her, his chest rising and falling like waves in a storm, and she watched him take off his helmet, revealing a face younger than she expected, scarred, but not cruel, with eyes that looked too tired to hate and hair damp with sweat. And when he reached for his bag again, she flinched until he showed her a packet of water, holding it up like an offering, and she nodded weakly, and he opened it and let her drink from his hand, because she couldn't hold it herself, and the water tasted like life and salt and something like kindness, and she looked at him with suspicion still, because kindness from the enemy felt like a trap, like bait for something worse. But he only leaned back and rubbed his face and looked at her leg, then looked at the bandage, then sighed like he knew it wasn't enough, and she knew it too, and she saw him take out something else, a metal rod and a packet of firegall, and she realized what he meant to do, and she began to shake and tried to push him away. But she was too weak, and he tried to comfort her with words she couldn't understand, and she screamed, not in anger, but terror, because cauterization meant agony, and she'd already drowned in too much of it. But he took her hand and placed it on his chest, and she felt his heartbeat. And then he handed her a strip of cloth to bite, and she didn't want to butt. She did because part of her wanted to live, and when the firegall hissed and the rod came close, she screamed even before it touched. But he didn't stop, and the pain was worse than anything she'd known, and she thought she might die from it. And then it was done, and her skin smoked, and her heart raced, and her breath came in broken sobs, and she hated him for hurting her, and loved him for staying. And when she opened her eyes, he was there, still holding her hand, with eyes full of guilt and sweat on his brow and blood on his gloves, not all of it hers. And she whispered something in her own language, a thank you, or maybe a curse. She wasn't sure, and he just nodded like he understood and reached for a cloth to wipe her face, and she let him and hated herself for it, because she had always been taught humans were cruel and savage, and this one had risked his life to carry her across a battlefield to burn her flesh in order to save her. And maybe that was savage too, but it was also something else, something that shook the foundation of everything she believed. And when he leaned back and closed his eyes, she looked at him like one would look at a storm, wondering if it would destroy or deliver, and she felt something stir in her chest, not hope, but the ghost of it. And as the night fell around them and the world went dark again, she whispered his name. Not because she knew it, but because in her head he needed one, and she called him Yalin, which meant firekeeper in her tongue, because he had burned her and saved her all in the same breath. And she didn't know what the next day would bring, or if she would live to see it, but she knew that tonight her enemy was watching over her, and that meant the war inside her had already changed. The night was long and cold and cruel, and every sound made her heart jump, even though she could barely move, even though her body screamed for sleep. She stayed awake because she feared she might not wake up again, and because she wanted to watch him, this strange human who had not left her side, even when the drones passed overhead, even when the ground shuddered with distant detonations. He kept one hand on the pistol at his hip, and the other resting near her shoulder, not touching her butt, close enough to shield her if he had to. And though they shared no words, she felt like they were speaking, like their silence meant something heavy and real. And when her breath grew shallow and the pain crept higher, he noticed he always noticed. And he moved like a soldier, but watched her like something more. And in the darkness she saw him pull out a data chip and press it against his gums. A flickering image appeared of a woman and a child, and his face softened into something almost broken. And she understood then that he had people he wanted to return to, and that scared her more than anything, because it meant he had everything to lose by helping her, and still he did it. And she wondered what kind of human would risk their future for someone who was supposed to be the enemy. And she didn't have answers, only more questions. And when the wind picked up and the shelter rattled, he threw his jacket over her without hesitation and sat with his back to the opening like a living shield. And she hated how grateful she felt, and hated how his warmth reminded her she was still alive. And when dawn bled through the sky like fresh wounds, they moved again. She tried to protest, but he shook his head and gently lifted her again. And she clung to him, not just because of the pain, but because she didn't know what else to do. And he carried her through mud and broken metal, through torn banners and crushed helmets, through the aftermath of war. And she saw how many had died and how few had been buried, and her heart ached for both sides, because death did not care who was right, only who was left. And when they reached a burned-out forward post, he set her down and began searching the ruins for supplies, and she watched him move with the focus of a surgeon and the desperation of someone running out of time. And when he returned with an old stretcher and a half-empty medkit, she smiled without meaning to, and he smiled back, and it felt strange, like two ghosts acknowledging each other. And when he redressed her wound and checked her pulse, she noticed how gentle he still was, like he feared breaking her further. And she reached out and touched his hand, and he froze like he didn't expect it. And she squeezed weakly to say, "I'm still here, and thank you." And he blinked fast, like something had cracked behind his eyes, and then nodded and looked away. And they rested in that ruin as the day wore on. And when a patrol passed close, she saw him reach for his weapon but not aim it. And she saw the way he watched them, with tension in every line of his body. And when they passed, without seeing them, he exhaled, and she felt the relief in her bones. And she whispered his name again, Yalin, even though it wasn't his real one, because it was easier than silence. And when he looked at her confused, she pointed to him and repeated it. And he smiled a little and pointed to himself and said his real name slowly. And she tried to say it, but it came out wrong. And he laughed quietly, not mocking, just soft and tired and kind. And then he pointed to her, and she hesitated, but said her name too. And he tried to repeat it and butchered it completely. And she laughed, and it felt strange and dangerous, but real. And they sat there in the middle of nowhere, wounded enemies sharing food from a single ration pack. And it felt like the war had paused just for them. And when she asked him with gestures why he saved her, he thought for a long time, then took a stick and drew two figures in the dirt, one falling, one helping, and then shrugged like it was just what you did, and she didn't believe that because no one else had done it, but she also didn't question it anymore. And when he gave her painkillers, she took them, and when he wrapped her in the emergency blanket, he shared it, and when she slept, she dreamed not of war, but of stars and fire and human eyes that looked at her without hatred, and when she woke, he was still there watching the horizon. And she knew that whatever came next she would follow him, not because she trusted him completely, but because in a world where everything had burned, he had become the only light she knew. The third day brought rain, heavy and bitter and cold as regret, and it soaked through what was left of their shelter and turned the earth into a sucking mud pit. And when she shivered, he wrapped her tighter in his jacket and covered them both with what remained of the emergency tarp, and they waited in silence while water dripped from steel beams, and the wind howled like a dying beast, and she watched the way he kept scanning the tree line, the ruined sky, the horizon, like danger was always coming, and maybe it was because danger always came for humans and aliens alike. And though her leg throbbed with a deep, angry heat, and her skin was pale beneath the strange warmth of his care, she never once heard him complain, even as his lips cracked from the cold and his hands trembled from hunger. And when she offered him the last strip of dried meat from his own pack, he refused and gave it back to her with a shake of his head, and that small gesture made something sharp twist inside her chest, because no one had ever put her above themselves, not in training, not in battle, not in life. And she wondered who had taught him to be like this, and if they were still alive. And when he finally dozed sitting upright with the rifle across his knees, she stared at his face and studied the lines carved there by war and time and sorrow, and she realized she wanted to know him, not just his kindness, but his reasons and his story, and what dreams he had before they were turned into smoke and ash. And when he woke with a sudden jerk from some nightmare, she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand. And though he looked startled, he didn't pull away, and she whispered her name again, and then pointed to her chest and said it once more, and this time he repeated it better and then said his again. And something passed between them, not just names, but something more like an invisible cord, pulling them closer across the divide of species and past and blood. And when the rain let up, they moved again, she on the stretcher now tied to it, with torn straps from uniforms they had found, and he dragging it slowly through wreckage and ruin and mud, and every step looked like it cost him more than he had to give. And she wanted to beg him to rest, but she also knew they had to keep going, because the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely someone would find them, and not everyone would be like him. And when she asked with her eyes where they were going, he pointed toward a rising hill with a long scarred ridge and mined a beacon, and she understood then that he was trying to reach a forward evac point, maybe for his people, maybe abandoned, maybe not, but it was hope. And she nodded and held on, and they moved hour by hour until the sun broke through the clouds and bathed them both in gold like forgiveness. And they sat there under that light for a moment, breathing in silence, and she asked him again with gestures why he stayed with her. And this time he didn't draw on the dirt, he just looked at her and said something quiet, and she didn't understand the words, but the way he said them made her chest tighten, and she wished she could speak his language, wished she could say what she felt, what burned inside her like a quiet fire. And when he leaned close to adjust her bandage, his face just inches from hers, she didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up and touched his cheek, and he froze, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the sounds of the world faded until there was just breath and heartbeat and eyes-searching eyes. And she didn't kiss him because she didn't understand if that was even a human thing or if he wanted it, but she wanted to, and he saw it and said her name like a question, and she smiled and nodded and said his in return, and something in the world shifted. Not loud like thunder, but quiet like the first snow, and they rested there until the sky began to darken again, and he helped her drink and wrapped her tighter and promised her with his eyes that they would make it. And she believed him, because hope was a dangerous thing, and she had already risked too much not to follow it. The path grew harder as they neared the ridge, and the broken land offered no mercy, only jagged roots and blackened trees and twisted debris from long-dead machines, and every time the stretcher caught on something he would grunt and pull harder, even as his muscles trembled and sweat dripped from his chin, and she wanted to stop him, wanted to tell him it was okay to rest, to leave her just for a while. But he wouldn't, even when his arm shook so badly that the stretcher swayed. He kept going, and when they finally reached the base of the ridge and saw what was left of the evac beacon, nothing more than a snapped pole and half a transmission dish buried in ash, she watched his shoulders slump like something inside him had finally cracked. But even then he didn't curse or scream or collapse. He just looked at her and gave a tired smile, like maybe he had known it was hopeless and still tried anyway. And she felt the sting of tears. She didn't want to cry again, but they came because his strength wasn't just in his body, it was in the way he kept choosing her, choosing to fight for her life when no one had asked him to. And she reached out her hand and he took it, and they sat there for a long time with wind in their hair and silence all around. And it wasn't peace, but it was something close. And when night fell again, he built a small fire with scraps of broken wood and old fuel cells, and huddled them close. And as she sat against him, wrapped in his jacket, breathing the smoke and warmth, she asked him with signs what came next, and he looked at the stars, then down the other side of the ridge and made a motion like walking, and she knew he was saying we keep moving, and she wanted to argue, but she didn't, because she knew he wouldn't stop, and she didn't want to be left behind, even if it killed them both. And when she dozed off that night, her head resting against his arm, she dreamed not of fire or screams or pain, but of a quiet place filled with strange green trees and soft wind, and his voice speaking her name like it meant something precious. And when she woke to the sound of footsteps, not his but sharp and fast, and many of them, she knew that dream was over and reality had come crashing back, and his hand was already on her mouth before she could speak, and his eyes wide and alert. And she heard the voices. They weren't his kind or hers, but raiders, mercenaries who fed on the ruins of war, who didn't care who you were, only what you could trade. And she knew if they found her, they would take her, and worse. And if they found him, they'd shoot first and loot later. And he reached for his rifle and held it close and waited like a statue with breath locked in his lungs. And she watched his hand tremble, but not from fear, from control, the kind that came from training and wounds and too many nights like this. And the voices passed slowly, too slowly, and she prayed to gods. She no longer believed in that they would keep walking. And when at last the last footfall faded into distance, she saw him relax and exhale and collapse just slightly, like he had held the whole world on his shoulders. And she reached up and touched his jaw, and he looked at her and nodded and whispered something soft, and she wished she could understand it, because she felt like it was important. And he looked down at her again and brushed a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her, and maybe she would let him, but he didn't. And instead he leaned his forehead to hers and closed his eyes, and that was more than enough. And when they finally moved again, it was slower, more careful, but something had changed between them, not just survival now, but connection, like two broken halves trying to fit and heal. And when she looked at him, she no longer saw an enemy, and when he looked at her, she saw herself reflected in his tired, quiet smile, and she wondered if they were still on opposite sides, or if somewhere between blood and bandages and fire, they had found something the war had failed to destroy. They walked when they could and dragged when they couldn't, and he never once left her side, even when his boots bled and his eyes burned from sleepless nights, and she watched his body grow thinner, his breath harder, but he never let her see defeat. And even though every mile took a piece of him, he gave it willingly, and when they found a crashed supply drone, mostly stripped but still holding a thermal blanket and 2 protein vials, she watched him lie and say he wasn't hungry, and she knew the truth because she had seen him watching her eat like it was a feast, but he smiled like it didn't matter, and she wanted to cry again because it wasn't fair that he gave so much and asked nothing, and she didn't know how to return that kind of grace. And the days blurred together, filled with silence and movement and little moments that felt like life, like when he found a flower growing through cracked concrete and tucked it behind her ear, or when she tried to mimic one of his human songs humming brokenly, and he laughed not to mock, but because it surprised him, and when he took her hand that evening, not for balance, not for comfort, but because he simply wanted to, she held it like it was the last warm thing in the world. And when the storms returned, they huddled in a drainage tunnel barely wide enough for them both, and he let her lean into him, even though his whole body shivered, and she pressed her hand against his chest, not to keep warm, but to keep his heart close, and she whispered her name again, and then his, and then hers one more time, and he repeated it. And they said nothing more, but their hands stayed laced through the night, and she knew the cold couldn't take them as long as they held on. And when morning came with bitter light and cruel wind, they moved again, and she could see the edge of the old map he had salvaged, where a red mark pulsed faintly, the old UN line, the place where maybe safety still existed, and she didn't believe in miracles, but she believed in him, and that was stronger. And they crossed what used to be a city, now just a graveyard of glass towers and bones, and she saw shadows in the windows and flickers of memories in the mirrors, and it haunted her more than the battlefield ever had, because here there were toys on the ground and empty shoes and scorched family photos, and it reminded her that war didn't just take soldiers, it swallowed futures. And when she saw him stop and pick up a tiny stuffed animal, she wanted to ask why, but the look on his face told her it was a memory too deep to speak, and she reached out and took it from him and placed it in the stretcher beside her, not for comfort, but for remembrance. And when they finally saw the UN perimeter fencing torn and rusted, but still standing, something inside both of them broke like a dam released, and she heard him whisper something that might have been "thank God," or maybe just "finally," and he pressed his gums against the gate and waited, and for a moment nothing happened, and her heart sank. But then a voice crackled through, rough and uncertain, and when it asked for identity, she saw him freeze, like he wasn't sure what to say, and then he looked at her and said her name first, not his, and that made her eyes burn, because it meant he didn't care what they thought, only that she lived. And when the gate unlocked with a whine like an old beast waking from sleep, she knew they had crossed a line no one could erase. And when the medics rushed out, weapons drawn at first, and saw her lying there, they hesitated, and she saw in their eyes the fear, the distrust, the question of why a human would save the enemy, and she felt the old shame rise again. But then he stood between them, his arms out, not in defiance, but in protection, and he said something sharp and full of steel, and the soldiers lowered their rifles slowly, and she didn't hear the rest because the pain finally pulled her under, and the last thing she saw before darkness took her again was his face close to hers, whispering her name like a promise that this wasn't the end. When she woke, the ceiling above her was white and soft and strange, and she felt something wrapped around her chest and something beeping beside her, and it took a moment to realize the pain in her leg was gone, not just dulled, but truly gone, and when she looked down she saw the new limb, metallic silver and alien to her, but clean and whole and functional. And she didn't know how to feel about it, not yet. But the part of her that had prepared to die on the battlefield could not stop staring at this new beginning, and when she turned her head and saw him asleep in the chair beside her, his arms folded, his face bruised and pale but peaceful, her breath caught because somehow he had made it too, and she didn't know how long he had stayed there, but she knew it was long enough for the nurses to bring him food he hadn't touched and for a blanket to be thrown over his lap, and she watched him like that for a while, memorizing every scar and line and quiet moment of his face. And when he stirred and opened his eyes and saw her awake, he smiled so softly it made her chest ache, and she whispered his name, and he came to her side and took her hand and said hers back like it was the most natural word in his mouth. And when she asked where they were, he explained slowly, pointing to the markings on the wall and drawing shapes with his fingers until she understood. This was a UN recovery station deep beneath the neutral zone, far from the Dominion, far from the front. And she asked if he was in trouble, and he shrugged like maybe, but not enough to care. And when she asked why he saved her again, he didn't answer with words, just reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and folded, and when he opened, it was the drawing he had made in the dirt that day, the two figures, one falling, one helping, and she remembered and touched the paper gently and said thank you, and then I'm sorry, and then I owe you my life, and he shook his head and said no. You owe me dinner, and she laughed, and it hurt, but she didn't care because it was the first time she had truly laughed in what felt like years and days later, when she could stand and walk on the prosthetic. He helped her learn how he held her waist when she stumbled and clapped when she took a step, and they sat outside the compound under artificial stars painted on the ceiling because the real sky was still dangerous, and he asked her to teach him her language, and she did, and she asked for his, and he taught her, and they made a game of it, naming things together like children discovering the world for the first time. And she told him about her sister, about the life she had left behind, and he told her about the daughter he hadn't seen in years, and they cried together one night under those fake stars and held each other, not like humans and aliens, but like two souls pulled from the fire and cooled in the same breath. And when she asked, "What happens now?" he said, "I don't know, but you're not going back." And she nodded and said, "Neither are you." And they both smiled because they didn't need war to define them anymore. And when the UN tribunal summoned him for questions about aiding the enemy, he stood in front of them and said her name first again, and said if saving her was a crime, then maybe humanity had forgotten what it was fighting for. And they let him go and didn't say another word. And when she walked beside him out of that room, hand in hand and head high, no one stopped them, and they left together, not toward the front or the fire, but toward a place beyond the maps, where names didn't matter and species didn't divide, and war was just something they survived, not something they lived for. And he still called her the name she gave him that first night, Yalan Firekeeper, and she still called him by his true name, but whispered it like a prayer because it was the sound of her salvation. And they built something together, not perfect, not easy, but real. And every time she stumbled, he caught her, and every time he faltered, she steadied him. And in the quiet spaces between war and memory, they found a truth louder than any explosion or scream, that sometimes the greatest victory isn't surviving the battle, it's choosing what kind of soul you carry out of it and never letting it go. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories that prove it.